safety talk here, unless you get the idea. So, as I said earlier, our walk is going to be going essentially on the Fighting Creek Nature Trail that's just down here. This is the trailhead for it, by the way. Just a couple of things to point out. When we're hiking, there's a couple of safety points to keep in mind. Even though today is a nice day outside, make sure you're drinking plenty of water, or if you have some kind of substance, probably not soda or coffee on hand. And throughout the hiking, I will do my best to make sure when we stop, we'll be in some shady spots throughout the park. But essentially, mostly on this trail, there's going to be a lot of shade, so hopefully not to fret about. But likewise, though, just a couple of things. In the park, there are, over 19,000 different species of animals, plants, all different kinds of life in this park. And so another term for this park that many people refer to is an international biosphere. Kind of like the Amazon forest, in a sense. Every day, we've suddenly discovered brand new species of plants, trees, or animals even that we have never seen before. And so sometimes that happens. It's just kind of unique. Scientists from all over the world sometimes come to this park on a regular basis just to kind of explore this area. And so keeping that in mind, there are some dangers when it comes to hiking. And I'll just kind of start light here. Primarily starting out with poison ivy. I'm sure you all have seen the most common form of poison ivy has how many leaves? 3 leaves. Yep. So we have a saying for that. Leaves of 3, let it be. And usually most of the common poison ivy you'll see right off the trails here or even further in. So a good rule of thumb is to stay on the trails, not to wander off the trails. If you do get in contact with poison ivy, usually instant soap and water clean, or we can get you back to the visitor center for that as well. In this park we actually have 2 kinds of poison ivy. So the leaves of 3, that's one of them. The other type, which you can't see around here, I'll point out later, is you have this kind of vine that kind of wraps around trees, kind of like this kind of fur on the outside. It's got when you see a vine that's got fur on the outside, we have a saying for that as well. Vines that are furry, they are scary. A little funny. But that's common throughout the park. So if you see any of those, obviously do not touch the vine, but for a better chance, don't also touch the tree as well that's in contact with it. Just a good rule of thumb. Other things that we may encounter throughout the park, you may have known, there are, even as we're going into the fall time, snakes, bees, and black bears are still out and about. They're getting ready for hibernation for some of the species, but keep in mind, bees, they make their nests just like snakes. They hide in dark areas, usually under rocks or into old woods or trees. And that brings up a point. Anyone that's allergic to bees by any chance? All right, that's good then. You say, in any worst case that something may happen with wildlife, I have a radio on hand. We can get in touch back with the visitor center. And when it comes to those kind of bees and snakes, just kind of let them pass by, or just kind of stay clear of them, go around them. Don't interact with them, because we do in fact have 2 types of venomous snakes. You have your copperheads, and you have your timber rattlesnakes. Those are pretty identifiable, mostly the rattlesnake, because it's got a rattle in the end. Also black bears. Black bears, they're still roaming around here. They're harvesting for tree nuts at this point of the season. And so if we ever get in contact with a bear, a good rule of thumb is to keep 50 yards away from them. And if we're too close to them, the best way you can get them away from you is to peer large and make loud noises. And so you can even talk to the bears. Say, "Hi, bear. How's the weather today? Nice seeing you, bear. Tell the family I said hi." Usually making a loud noise and peering big like this, the bear will walk off. Usually we haven't had any encounterments of bears interacting with people. Usually those kind of bears are those who are looking for food, which, feeding bears, feeding them, do not do that. It's actually prohibited by law. And last but not least, before we get going down this trail here, is leave no trace. I've been a Boy Scout, fun fact, for about the last 12 years of my life, or I just want to think of it that way. And leave no trace applies to not picking up rocks, do not pick up flowers. That is actually a federal offense on this property, and so you may have heard different sayings for leave no trace. One of the most popular ones is leave only footprints and take only photos. So do keep that in mind as we go through a trail. But enough said about safety. We're going to make our way onto the trail here, unless anyone has any questions before we get started. All right then, let's make our way down the trail.
Somebody got a signal. It's a box elder tree.
Now we didn't travel too far here, but this is a good spot to pull off here. All right, a little bit of nature, a little bit of history here. So a lot of the trees around here, as you can tell, they are not old growth forests. What we define as old growth forests are trees that are over 100 years old. And so this national park has been around for ages and ages, even back at the time of the Little Ice Age. And so the first people that came through this area were in fact not the white settlers, but who would you say were the first people to come into these parks, this area? The Indians, yeah. And in this case, we would say the Cherokee Indians as well. They are pretty predominant, as you may notice. Just on the other side of the mountains is the Cherokee Indian Reservation. The Cherokees, in fact, have derived. They're kind of a sub-tribe of the famous Iroquois Indians. The Iroquois were predominant in the Great Lakes area and up in New England area, and so reasons unknown. Some stories, why they came down this way, but the Cherokees, they kind of branched off from their group and came down this area in the thousands BCs, long before the first white people came to North America. And the way that they got around these areas were Indian footpaths. And so back then, of course, you didn't have your modern roads, you didn't have your horse and buggy and stuff like that. They would travel on foot through these areas here, mostly to travel, but also to hunt. So most of the prominent animals they hunt small mammals, they'll hunt bears, elk in this area. And when the first settlers came in this area, by the mid to late 1600s, they came in contact with them. They considered them as one of the many civilized tribes for two reasons. One, the Cherokee Indians were a very structured-based system. They weren't a loose nomadic tribe. They were a permanent settlement. They would build their establishment in one place, and they would thrive in that area. Unlike others, such as your Normans up in Mongolia, they would transportate every 6 months or so. The other reason is because they got a pretty good structuralized agricultural society. They based most of their life on farming foods and materials, hunting on the side, but also they have a really good language system, which still survives to this day, thanks to one of the surviving tribes in this area. But the Cherokee Indians, they usually didn't create a massive impact in this area. Mostly, like I said, they relied on footpaths through the park, and as you may have noticed already, coming through this park here, this actually was believed to be an old Indian footpath that was turned into a road by the 1920s. And so, usually the first pass through here, white settlers, when they would come through this area, they would turn a lot of the old Indian footpaths into their first wagon roads as well. And so this was a road, if you were here in 1920s, this would have been an actual road coming through here, and it goes all the way up to Fighting Creek. But following the Indians, of course, you had your first white settler, your first white people, not necessarily settlers, but what you would consider your frontiersmen and your pioneers. And so this kind of settles in the time frame of the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And so why would frontiersmen and pioneers come in this area? Well, mainly after American Revolution, many of them would have some kind of form of a land warrants. And so this would be signed by their governor or by their acting superior, pretty much saying that I hereby declare that permission for you to survey 40 acres of land beyond this point and claim it as yours. Because mostly after the American Revolution, the Americans were kind of free to go past the Appalachian Mountains at this point, because prior to that, King George, after the French and Indian War, pretty much cut off his own colonists from going past the Appalachian Mountains. That was one of the many reasons you learned in school what caused the American Revolution. They were pretty upset. It was the proclamation of 1763. Usually, and when you think of pioneers, you know, you think of Daniel Boone, you think of surveyors like Lewis and Clark, even George Washington before he became a general in the Continental Army. He was actually a surveyor. He surveyed what would be present-day Alexandria as well, which is pretty cool. He did that when at a young age. But following the pioneers and settlers that would survey this area, they would start marking up their own territory. Settlers would start to come in. They would kind of take chances, and they would leave the comforts of the eastern coast, and they would come to these areas to begin a new life. And some say that even the first earliest mountain men came in this area before the settlers even. So many of the early families, such as Obie family and the Ogle families, came in to this area as early as the early 1800s, supposedly. And with that in mind, we're going to walk a little bit further here and talk about the first communities that came up in this area, which maybe as a shocker to you, they didn't necessarily start growing in the 1900s, but they started much earlier than that. Stuff around here.
Baby beech trees.
Like I said, you can see a lot of the short shrubbery around here, and sometimes right off the trail here, or a little further in, you can kind of see a lot of poison ivy. I'm telling you.
Oh yeah. Spice bush. There's no leaves on it anymore.
Nope.
We made tea out of spice bush. Sycamore tree.
Yep, sycamore.
Lots of big sycamores on the tree. Tulip tree.
Yellow poplar, tulip.
So unfortunately, this branch here, this is actually a little water branch right here. When we refer to it as a branch, it's a little waterway. It's kind of dried up. As I said, we've been kind of in a drought for about a month, but usually in the wet season, this would be about a foot deep in the water. But this is the ash hopper branch right here. And you can kind of see, just off the side here, you can kind of see this little lifted ground right here next to it. This is another path right here. This is probably one of the earliest wagon paths here, because when the first white settlers came to this area, their main modes of transportation was actually taking their horses and buggies and wagons on these riverbeds right here. And usually in a dry season like this, that wouldn't be a problem for them. But say if it like rained for 6 consecutive days, it's going to get flooded out. And so what many early settlers decided to do, on top of taking the old Indian footpaths, was they would raise the path above the river and put it right next to them. As a matter of fact, one person, she lived in Forks of River, last name Ogle, she mentioned about the fact that the old dirt roads was big enough for a wagon team, and they weren't really good grounds either. It was really hard to find some straight roads in this area. So, of course, unlike today, you know, we have straight paths that cut right through mountains. They didn't have that at all. Not yet, of course. But for most of them, it was kind of hard to navigate through these areas. But back on the point about the first communities, some people believe that the first communities that were developed around here probably was as early as the early 1800s. Right around this area. And I got a little illustration here I'll pass around to you guys. Did a little self-drawing myself. I'm a little bit of an artist. But you can see, I got 4 different colors on here. You have Forks of River, Fighting Creek, Sugarlands, and then Roaring Fork, you know the Motor Nature Trail loop right there?
Mm-hmm.
This was actually a thriving community as well. And so I got same deal on the other side as well. And surprisingly, this little gray box right here, this is present-day Gatlinburg, which back as early as the 1850s was referred to as Baskin Creeks before it was named Gatlinburg, before the Civil War. But the three major communities right around here, they started up roughly around the 1740s or 1750s. Supposedly, maybe as early as 1810s because of John Obie on the far end over here. He came in this area and built his cabin before the American Civil War. And so he actually came from Virginia. His ancestors fought in the American Revolution, particularly with the North Carolina militia taking place. He was at Mountain, he was possibly at Guilford Courthouse, and so his family came down to this area after the American Revolution, and they lived here for generations. And just to give you an idea, forks in the river, and this is where we are right here, the purple area, this stretched only about 2 miles square. I hope I didn't say that wrong, but that's right, it's 2 miles square, was roughly about the size of it. And one woman in particular, her name was Gladys Trenham Russell, she perfectly described this community. She said that the community roughly was only about 2 miles square, and within this 2 mile square area, you had about 30 families. And this is the funny part coming up here. She says, out of the 30 families, 14 of them were Trenhams, and the rest were Trenham in-laws. The reason I say that is because one of the biggest things in these communities here, you'll find out when you go anywhere, is that all these families intermarried with different families. So you may have an Ogle married to a Husky, or a Husky married to a Hurley, and and it's for anyone that does family genealogy. Anyone does family genealogy in your household? If you try to do a family genealogy for this, it's kind of a nightmare. Let me just tell you. But just to get you an idea of some numbers, you had about, as I said, 30 families between here all the way down to Gatlinburg. For the Sugarlands area, so up here in the blue, this is where, this is actually, if you kind of imagine, today there's a road that goes up to Newfound Gap. You're pretty much going right through the community area right there when you're heading up to Newfound Gap. They had this was the most dense area. It had about 80 families compared to Cades Cove, which had about the same numbers. And then, of course, the other one you have Fighting Creek. Fighting Creek had about 30 families. And if you go through Gatlinburg today, you've probably seen some modern day advertisement that says, Cars Motor College or Ogle's this or stuff like that. A lot of those names derive from the ancient families that lived in this area for generations. And Gladys Trenham Russell, she was actually one of the last people who was born in the parks before she left this area, and she continued to live in Pigeon Forge before she passed away. So she was one of those descendant families. But with that being said, we're going to walk across the bridge here. I definitely ask that y'all keep in mind about, think about this path here and think about the trees in this area here. As we continue going through here, we'll talk a little bit more about nature at our next little stop here. I particularly like this little park.
Looks like a road.
Even after 30 plus years, you can still see this old
Yeah, that's a big sassafras. Yep. Make some sassafras tea.
Oh yeah. Sassafras. I think either that one or the tree that's further up. It's one of my favorite trees, mostly because it's one of the original ingredients to root beer.
Yep. Spice bush makes a good tea too.
Some good stuff.
Dandelion root tea. Nice big pine cones right there.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit more water here and a little bit here.
tree.
As promised, I'd tell you, or I'd show you another type of poison ivy we have in this park. And as a matter of fact, you can kind of see two great examples. This tree right here and the tree next to it. You can see this kind of furry thing climbing up the trees right there. That's actually poison ivy as well. Definitely not recommended to touch the tree nor its vine for reasons. But while we're standing here, this is a really great spot to probably cause a little bit of shock here, not too much, but whether you may know it or not, this area right around here, since leaving the visitor center, was once a former cornfield. These were once cornfields for as far as you can see, and kind of get you an idea. Some open lands in the area here. The cornfields that were once dominant in this area were owned by a gentleman by the name of Joe Carr, which today you see his last name spelled as C-A-R-R. That was only after 1926. Before 1926, it was spelled K-E-A-R. Reasons I will go back and figure out why the last name changed. Probably because of different family confusion. But just to get you an idea, the cornfields, were as far as you can see from the visitor center to Fighting Creek, which we'll get to in a second. And the Joe Carr house and barn actually sits right where the VC stands right now. That was right where his house once stood. And the reason I bring that up is because, unfortunately, by the 1930s, the federal government came in here and they started buying up land. Mostly to start beginning the efforts for preserving a national park in the Smoky Mountains. It was an idea that in fact had started as far back as 1926. A gentleman that was living out in Elkmont, his wife, was wondering, well, this is all nice and this stuff, but why can't we turn this into a national park? And that's what started the idea. Many people were against it because you had thousands of families still living in this area, but some people were wanting to protect this actually. On top of the lumbering company that came through and on top of the overhunting that was happening, they figured it was a good idea. And when the federal government came in here, what they pretty much did was they were offering to pay a lot of money to a lot of the families in this area to say, hey, why don't you, we'll give you about $1,000 if you pack up your stuff and move out of the park. For some people, they took that money and left. We're not sure if Joe Carr was one of those people or he was kind of one of the last man standing kind of moments. But other families, they refused to leave because one, it was their ancestral grounds, they've been living there for years, or they were, it had some meaning to them. So for some of those people, they either had short time or lifetime leases, which meant that if you had a lifetime leases, you were allowed to stay on this property until you died. And then once you died, that property would be given to the government. Short time leases, similar deal. You can keep the land as long as you want until you decide to give it up. For those who chose to stay here, had it much harder than they would have had before the government took place, because while they were still living here, they mainly relied on hunting, growing crops, and thriving off the resource in this area. But when the government came through here, they said, all right, no hunting, no cutting down trees, no growing additional crops or expanding. And this was kind of hurting them. And so that was kind of further pushing them to leave the parks. And so when the last settlers leave in this area here, what the parks essentially did was they took down a lot of the structures, which is kind of sad for a historian like myself. But for a lot of the open fields, such as this former cornfield, they just let them overgrow. And so there's a process in which many of you have gone through science class, or will be going through science class about, and it's called a process of reforestation. And there's many steps to it, but I pretty much categorize it down to 4 simple steps. Did I say 4? 4. Gotta go back to elementary school. So the first one pretty much usually happens between the day that the property was left abandoned all the way up to 12 months or a whole year. In that first whole year, the cornfields would start teeming with poison ivy, with your small little shrubbery, your flowers. It would start to overgrow, even with some massive roots in the area, or small trees. That was your first stage. Your second stage, which usually happens, after about a year or two after the person owning the property left, you would have what is referred to as, reading off my notes here, what's called as the young forest. And so a young forest, what that defines is that you start having your first trees pop up. And your trees would be your tulip poplars, your young pines, and some great examples of that. You can kind of see There's some tall ones already that are already more than 2 years old, but you got still some small ones back here. These are the ones that are first trees to usually pop up usually. Following them, these trees would either die down, they would go through decomposition, and new trees would pop up, creating a mature forest. A mature forest would contain your white oaks, your hickories, and your hemlocks would start to appear. And so a great example of a hemlock is this tree right here, which before we leave here, you'll get a chance to stand up next to the tree, and if you look straight up, it is straight as a barrel. The reason why it is
over here.
gravity, some people say, but hemlocks is pretty unique for a couple of reasons. One, it is the state tree of Tennessee. The other thing is, this was the primary tree that settlers would cut down to make their cabins out of. If you cut the pieces and you put it in a cabin, after 10 years of cutting that tree, the wood is going to still be pretty straight. Compared to a white pine, if you let a white pine sit for about 10 years, it's going to start warping back into its irregular shape. And so you got your hemlocks, your oaks, they start to appear. Following them, you have your fourth and final stage, which is referred to as a climax forest, or your old growth forests. These are forests now containing with your beeches, your hemlock still, and also your sugar maples. And I got a great picture of a sugar maple here, not to confuse you with the maple trees that you may be familiar with back at home for most folks. But your sugar maple trees have this kind of pretty red color to it. The sugar maple trees were in fact probably the most dominant tree in this area before white settlers came into this area. And henceforth the name of this area was named after the sugar maples. What's unique about them is that they have this rich sap on the inside of the trees, and you might be seeing where I'm going with here. Used for maple syrup, for sweeteners, and sometimes settlers would mix it with different ingredients, for some herbs or for some sweetening stuff. Not for coffee, maybe for coffee and tea, but for other things. For a climax forest, probably to be in this area, probably would take almost a lifetime to get to. And so I would probably be past my 90s before a climax forest would appear here. This is kind of like what it is right now. It's kind of still in that young forest stage, kind of transitioning into a mature forest slowly. It's getting there. But like I said though, if you were here in the 1920s, 1930s, you would pretty much be walking right in the middle of a cornfield. And so it's pretty cleared out. And this is great that this area has a great example that even with these small shrubberies here, it's still very spacious. And that's why it gives that impression of a former cornfield. Probably if you give it another 10, 20 years, you couldn't really tell it was a former cornfield because you'll have bigger trees growing in this area. But as we walk to our next destination, feel free to walk up to the hemlock here and take a straight up look at it. Also, if you press your thumbnail against the bark of the tree, it has that odd feeling of a cork. It has that odd feeling of cork, surprisingly enough, which is pretty unique of itself. It's kind of referred to as a softwood. Yeah, there's a whole lot of hemlocks here that are coming back to the forest, so it's kind of nice.